July 11th, 1968. The day respect died on Lenox Avenue. The Godfather was dead. Ellsworth Raymond Bumpy Johnson, the man who'd ruled Uptown's underworld for 4 decades, the chess master who'd outmaneuvered the Italian mob, survived Alcatraz, and turned the streets of Harlem into his personal kingdom, was lying in a bronze casket at St. Martin's Episcopal Church on 122nd Street. He had collapsed 2 days earlier at Wells' restaurant, a chicken wing halfway to his mouth, his massive heart finally surrendering after 62 years of carrying the weight of an empire. The funeral wasn't just a burial, it was the coronation of a ghost. By 9 a.m., Lenox Avenue was strangled with humanity. Thousands of people pressed against police barricades, climbing fire escapes, perching on car roofs, hanging from windows like human ornaments. It was an ocean of black and brown faces, grief and anxiety mingling in the summer heat. The crowd wasn't just mourning a man, they were mourning protection, they were mourning order. Bumpy had been the dam. With him gone, everyone could feel the flood coming. Inside St. Martin's, the air was thick enough to chew. It reeked of expensive lilies, old wood polish, and something harder to name, fear dressed in Sunday clothes. The pews were packed with Harlem's entire spectrum, jazz legends who'd played at Bumpy's clubs, judges who'd taken his money, politicians who'd asked for his endorsement, and enforcers whose hands were permanently stained with the work they'd done in his name. Flashbulbs popped like small arms fire, illuminating faces that had learned long ago how to hide what they really felt. And sitting in the front row, a figure carved from obsidian and 40 years of survival, was Mamie Hatcher Johnson.
Mamie sat with her spine straight as a ruler, her black dress immaculate, her veil obscuring eyes that hadn't stopped calculating since the moment she'd walked through those church doors. To everyone watching, she was the portrait of a grieving widow, dignified, stoic, unbreakable. The woman who had stood beside the king for decades, who had raised his daughter, who had kept his home while he kept the streets. But beneath that veil, Mamie was doing what she'd always done, reading the room. She knew every face in that church. She knew who had been loyal, who had been bought, and who was already mentally dividing up Bumpy's territory like vultures circling fresh meat. She could see the FBI agents in the back row, their notepads out, documenting everything. She could see the young hustlers, eyes bright with ambition, studying the older boss's jewelry, calculating what they could take once the funeral was over. But there was one person Mamie was scanning for, one face she had prayed, actually gotten down on her knees and prayed, would have enough sense, enough respect, enough basic human decency to stay away. Bumpy Johnson had been a man of enormous appetites. He loved Langston Hughes' poetry. He loved chess tournaments that lasted until dawn. He loved fried chicken from Wells. And yes, he loved women. Mamie had known this from the beginning. She had made her peace with it somewhere around 1952, the way a general makes peace with rain during a campaign. It was inevitable, so you adapted. Being married to a king meant sharing him with his kingdom, and sometimes that included sharing him with women who didn't understand the difference between being favored and being family.
She had tolerated the late nights, the unexplained absences, the perfume that wasn't hers on his collar. She had tolerated them because she understood something those other women never would. At the end of every night, Bumpy came home to her. She was the wife. She was the partner. She was the queen. The others were just courtesans passing through. But in the last year of Bumpy's life, there had been a new girl, a problem that smelled like cheap perfume and wore ambition like costume jewelry. Her name was Rochelle, though she'd started calling herself Shelley in a pathetic attempt at sophistication. She was 24 years old, all legs and attitude, with a voice that carried 3 blocks and a laugh that sounded like breaking glass. She wasn't like Helen Lawrenson, the sophisticated writer who genuinely cared about Bumpy's mind. She wasn't like the quiet neighborhood girls who'd understood the code and knew their place. Rochelle was new Harlem. She was the generation that thought the rules were suggestions. She loved cameras. She loved being seen hanging on Bumpy's arm at the Red Rooster. She loved telling anyone who'd listen that she was special to him, that what they had was real. In his declining health, Bumpy had been soft with her. He'd enjoyed the way she looked at him like he was still 35, still invincible. He'd let her get away with things that would have gotten anyone else cut off years ago. Mamie had warned him. "Ellsworth," she'd said one night, watching him count money at the kitchen table, "that girl doesn't respect the game. She thinks this is a movie. She's going to embarrass you." Bumpy had laughed, waving her off. "She's just a kid, Mamie. Let her have her moment." Now Bumpy was dead, and Mamie was praying that Rochelle had enough sense to let the man have his funeral in peace.
A funeral is sacred ground. It's the last moment of dignity a family gets before memory becomes myth. It's not a place for side pieces. It's not a place for women who couldn't be bothered to show up when he was sick, but suddenly have feelings now that there are cameras around. It's a place for the wife. The organ swelled, filling the cathedral with a mournful hymn that seemed to seep into the bones of everyone present. Reverend Marcus Reed, a mountain of a man who'd known Bumpy since they were boys running numbers in the 1920s, stepped to the pulpit. His voice, when it came, could have shaken dust from the rafters. "Ellsworth Johnson was a lion," he boomed, "a lion who walked among us, who protected this community when no one else would, who fed families when the city forgot they existed." "Amen," the congregation murmured. "Tell it," someone called from the balcony. Mamie felt tears finally track down her cheeks beneath the veil. For just a moment, she allowed herself to stop being the strategist, stop being the guardian of Bumpy's legacy, and just be a woman who'd lost her husband. Her gloved hands clutched a handkerchief so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. Then the doors at the back of the church groaned open. It wasn't subtle. A blade of harsh July sunlight sliced through the dim sanctuary, so bright it made people in the back pews wince and turn away. The organ faltered for half a note. The reverend's voice caught. Every head in St. Martin's turned. Walking down the center aisle, her stiletto heels clicking on the stone floor like a countdown to detonation, was Rochelle.
The audacity was breathtaking. In a sea of respectful black and navy, Rochelle was wearing a dress that screamed for attention. Yes, it was black, technically, but it was skin-tight, cut so low her cleavage was practically holding a press conference, slid up one thigh like she was heading to a nightclub instead of a funeral. She wore a wide-brimmed hat that rivaled Mamie's and sunglasses so large they covered half her face. She wasn't walking with her head bowed. She wasn't trying to slip in unnoticed. She was strutting, posing, working the aisle like it was a runway and she was the main event. A collective gasp rippled through the church. The old-timers, men who'd been with Bumpy since the Prohibition days, exchanged looks of pure disbelief. This was a violation of the highest order. You could be a mistress, that was between a man, his wife, and God, but you didn't disrespect the family at the funeral. You didn't show up to the burial of a king dressed like you were auditioning for a chorus line. Mamie felt the shift in the room before she saw it. She heard the gasps, felt the tension spike like static electricity before a lightning strike. Slowly, with the kind of control that comes from decades of surviving in a world that wanted to break her, she turned her head. Through the black lace of her veil, she saw Rochelle gliding down the aisle. Mamie didn't move. She didn't gasp. She went perfectly, terrifyingly still. Her hands, which had been clutching that handkerchief like a lifeline, slowly unclenched. She smoothed the fabric against her lap with the kind of deliberate precision that made the men sitting near her lean back slightly. They knew that movement. They'd seen it before in Bumpy's face, right before someone disappeared. Inside Mamie's chest, grief was transforming into something infinitely more dangerous. This wasn't just disrespect. This was a declaration. Rochelle was telling the world, I mattered too. I have a right to be here. I'm part of the legend. Over Mamie's dead body. Rochelle didn't stop at the back. She didn't slide into an empty pew near the door where she might have escaped notice. She kept walking, past the associates, past the cousins, past the nieces and nephews. She walked all the way to the third row, just 2 rows behind Mamie, and squeezed herself into a space that didn't exist, forcing an elderly aunt to shift over with an audible grunt of protest. The church fell into the kind of silence that precedes violence. Reverend Reed cleared his throat, attempting to regain control of his service, but it was too late. Every eye in St. Martin's was now on the third row, where Rochelle was making a grand show of removing her sunglasses with a theatrical flourish and pulling out a tissue to dab at completely dry eyes. "Oh, Bumpy," she wailed, just loud enough to be heard over the Reverend's renewed sermon. "My sweet, sweet Bumpy." Mamie sat like a statue of vengeance. She didn't turn around. She stared straight ahead at the bronze casket, at the mountain of white roses covering it, at the photograph of Bumpy from 1945 when he was young and sharp and dangerous. But the men closest to her, Red Murray and Junie Boy Collins, Bumpy's most trusted lieutenants, they saw the change in her eyes. They saw the steel shutter coming down. They'd seen Bumpy get that same look right before he ordered someone erased from the earth. The service crawled forward for another excruciating hour. It was torture. Every time Reverend Reed made a poignant point about Bumpy's generosity or strength, Rochelle would let out a dramatic moan. "Yes, Lord, tell it. He was so good to me," drawing attention back to herself, turning tragedy into theater. She was hijacking the funeral. She was turning Bumpy Johnson's final farewell into the Rochelle show. The disrespect was accumulating like pressure in a boiler, building toward an explosion that everyone could feel coming, but no one could stop. Finally, mercifully, Reverend Reed concluded. The choir rose, their voices lifting in "Precious Lord, Take My Hand," the hymn filling every corner of the church. 6 pallbearers, the biggest, toughest men in Harlem, enforcers who'd broken bones for Bumpy, stepped forward to lift the heavy bronze casket. The congregation stood. Mamie rose slowly, supported by her daughter and sister. She turned to follow the casket out. As she turned, her eyes locked directly onto Rochelle in the third row. Rochelle didn't look away. She stared right back. And then she did something unforgivable. She smirked. It was tiny, fleeting, gone in less than a second, replaced by her mask of exaggerated grief. But Mamie saw it. It was a look of triumph, a look that said, "I'm here, and you can't do anything about it. I'm part of history now." Mamie walked past her without a word. She kept her head high, her shoulders back, following the body of her husband down the aisle, through the gauntlet of mourners, out into the blinding afternoon sun. The crowd outside roared as the church doors opened. The noise was deafening, thousands of voices calling Bumpy's name, crying, celebrating his life. The humidity hit them like walking into a sauna. The hearse waited at the bottom of the stone steps, its engine idling, ready to carry Harlem's king to his final rest. Mamie descended carefully, one step at a time. Her heart was pounding a slow, heavy rhythm behind her ribs. "Just get him in the car," she told herself. "Just get to Woodlawn Cemetery. Don't make a scene. Not today. Not for Ellsworth." She reached the sidewalk. The pallbearers began sliding the heavy casket into the back of the hearse. Mamie stood by the open door of the family limousine, ready to get in, to close the door on this nightmare, to mourn in peace. But Rochelle wasn't done. The younger woman had pushed her way through the crowd exiting the church, had elbowed past family members, had maneuvered around the security detail. She burst out onto the sidewalk, her heels clicking frantically. She wasn't heading for her own car. She wasn't heading into the crowd. She was heading straight for the hearse. Rochelle rushed toward the open back of the vehicle, where the casket was still partially visible. She threw her arms out dramatically, creating a spectacle for the thousands of people lining the street, for the photographers whose cameras were already raised. "Don't take him!" she screamed, her voice cracking with theatrical anguish. "I need to say goodbye. He loved me. He told me I was his real soulmate."
The crowd went silent. You could have heard a pin drop on Lenox Avenue. The photographers' cameras came up. Pop, pop, pop. This was the shot, the scandal, the mistress throwing herself on the casket while the widow watched. Mamie froze, her hand still on the limousine door. She watched this girl, this child who knew nothing about the 40 years Mamie had spent building Bumpy's empire beside him, who'd never sat in a prison visiting room, who'd never hidden money from police raids, who'd never held Bumpy through the nightmares he'd never admit to having. She watched this girl try to steal her husband's funeral, watched her reach out to touch the bronze handle of the casket, wailing about her baby. Something inside Mamie Johnson snapped clean in half. The code of silence, of dignity, of looking the other way, of being the bigger person. It evaporated like water on hot asphalt. Bumpy was gone. The rules had changed. There was no one left to protect this girl from herself, and there was no one left to hold Mamie back. Mamie let go of the limousine door. She turned. She didn't run. Queens don't run. Legends don't scramble. But she moved with a speed that made her veil flutter, with a purpose that parted the crowd like the Red Sea. Her heels struck the pavement with the force of a judge's gavel coming down for a death sentence. Rochelle was so busy performing, so busy making sure the cameras captured her tears, so busy believing she'd won, that she didn't see the storm coming until it was right on top of her. Mamie didn't scream. She didn't shout insults. She simply reached out and grabbed.
The silence on Lenox Avenue was absolute. Thousands of people held their breath. The traffic stopped. The wind died. All eyes focused on the two women standing at the back of the hearse. Mamie Johnson didn't grab Rochelle by the arm. She didn't grab her shoulder to gently guide her away. Mamie reached out and grabbed Rochelle by the hair. It wasn't a tug, it was a vice grip. 40 years of controlled rage released in one motion. Mamie's gloved fingers tangled into the expensive, elaborately styled wig Rochelle was wearing. In one fluid, violent motion, Mamie yanked backward with strength that seemed impossible for a woman her size. "Get your filthy hands off my husband," Mamie hissed, her voice low and guttural and terrifying. Rochelle's head snapped back. Her scream changed from theatrical grief to genuine shock and pain. "Let go! Are you crazy? Let go of me!" she shrieked, arms flailing, trying to claw at Mamie's wrist. But Mamie didn't let go. She twisted her grip, using the hair like a leash, forcing Rochelle to stumble backward, away from the casket, away from Bumpy, away from everything she had no right to touch. The crowd erupted. A collective "ah" rippled through the onlookers like a wave.
This wasn't a polite society snub. This was a street fight. This was Harlem justice, raw and real. "You think this is a stage?" Mamie said, her voice rising now, carrying over the crowd. "You think this is your moment? This is my husband. This is my life. You're a footnote, baby, a mistake he made when he was tired and old." Rochelle tried to spin around, tried to regain her balance and her dignity.
Her voice came out shrill and desperate. "He loved me. He told me you were just the old habit he couldn't break. I was the one who made him feel alive." It was the absolute worst thing she could have said. Mamie didn't just hold the hair, she used it as a lever, dragging Rochelle away from the hearse, away from the sanctuary of death, out into the full judgment of the street. Rochelle's heels skidded on the pavement, her designer hat tumbled off and rolled into the gutter. The illusion shattered instantly. She wasn't glamorous anymore, she was just a messy, screaming girl being handled by a woman who'd survived things Rochelle couldn't imagine. "He didn't love you," Mamie said, pulling Rochelle close, face to face. Mamie lifted her veil with her free hand, revealing eyes that were bone-dry and burning with cold fire. "He tolerated you. He bought you things to keep you quiet. But look where you are now, sweetheart. You're outside, and you're always going to be outside." Mamie gave one final, decisive yank. The wig shifted violently, sliding off Rochelle's head, revealing her natural hair flattened and disheveled underneath. Then Mamie shoved her. Rochelle stumbled backward, tripped over her own feet, and fell hard onto the sidewalk. She landed on her hands and knees, the expensive black dress tearing at the knee, her dignity shredding even faster. Mamie held the wig for one long second, then dropped it onto the ground next to Rochelle like garbage. The photographers went wild. Pop, 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 pop. They captured the image that would become legendary. The mistress on her knees in the dirt, and the queen standing over her, adjusting her gloves. "You don't ride with the family," Mamie said, her voice cutting through the humid air like a blade. "And you don't touch the king. Go home, little girl, before I bury you next to him." Rochelle looked up. She looked at the crowd. She looked for sympathy, for support, for anyone to defend her. She found nothing but judgment and barely suppressed laughter. "Tell her, Mamie!" someone shouted from a fire escape. "That's how you handle that!" another voice yelled. "Respect the queen!" came a cry from the crowd. Laughter began to bubble up from the onlookers, cruel and mocking. Rochelle scrambled to her feet, grabbed her wig from the ground, and clutched it to her chest. Her face was bright red beneath her makeup. She looked at the hearse one last time, then at Mamie. The arrogance was gone. The showgirl persona had evaporated. She was humiliated, destroyed, erased. She turned and ran, pushing through the crowd, shielding her face from the cameras, disappearing into the sea of bodies on Lenox Avenue. Mamie watched her go. She didn't chase, she didn't shout anything else. She simply took a deep breath, smoothed the front of her dress, and adjusted her veil back over her face. She turned to the pallbearers who were standing frozen, unsure whether to be terrified or impressed. "Put him in the car," Mamie said calmly. "We have a schedule to keep." The men scrambled to obey. The casket was loaded, the doors closed. Mamie walked back to the limousine. Her family was inside, staring at her with wide eyes. Her daughter's mouth was hanging open. "Mama," her daughter whispered as Mamie slid into the leather seat. "I can't believe you just did that." Mamie pulled the door shut, sealing them in the cool, quiet, air-conditioned interior. She looked out the tinted window at the crowd, which was now cheering, clapping, celebrating the show of strength they'd just witnessed. She removed her gloves slowly, placing them carefully in her purse. "Your father worked too hard for his name," Mamie said softly. "I wasn't going to let a $50 girl tarnish a $1 million legacy." The procession began to move. The long line of black Cadillacs wound through Harlem like a funeral snake, past the jazz clubs Bumpy had owned, past the corners where his numbers runners had worked, past the people he'd fed during the Depression. The story spread faster than the cars could drive. By the time they reached Woodlawn Cemetery, the tail had already grown legs. Mamie had punched her. Mamie had thrown her into traffic. Mamie had ripped out her real hair. But the truth was simpler and more powerful. Mamie had drawn a line. She had shown Harlem that she wasn't just Bumpy's widow. She was Bumpy's partner. She was his equal. and she would protect his legacy the way he would have, swiftly, publicly, and without mercy. The burial was peaceful. No more interruptions. Bumpy was lowered into the ground in a plot reserved for Harlem royalty. Mamie threw the first handful of dirt onto the casket. She didn't cry then. She saved her tears for the empty house waiting for her. That night, Harlem held a wake that lasted until the sun came up. They poured liquor on the corners. They played Bumpy's favorite records. And in every bar from the Red Rooster to Small's Paradise, the topic wasn't just Bumpy. It was Mamie. Did you hear what she did? Snatched that girl's wig clean off her head. Bumpy's gone, but the Johnson name ain't dead. The incident served a crucial strategic purpose. With Bumpy gone, the wolves were circling. The Italian families, the young drug dealers, the corrupt cops who'd been on Bumpy's payroll. They were ready to tear his empire apart, piece by piece. They'd assumed Mamie was a soft target. They'd assumed she'd retreat into widowhood and let them loot everything Bumpy had built. But the story of the wig snatching sent a clear signal to the streets. Mamie Johnson was not to be trifled with. She still had fight in her. She still had teeth. And it bought her respect. In the months that followed, when men came to discuss business or tried to intimidate her into signing over property deeds, they remembered the look in her eyes on those church steps. They remembered that she was the woman who had publicly humiliated a challenger and walked away with her head high.
Rochelle was never seen in Harlem again. Rumor had it she moved to Detroit or maybe down south. She became a ghost story, a cautionary tale whispered to young girls with stars in their eyes. Don't be a Rochelle. Don't try to wear a crown that was never meant for you. Mamie lived for many more years after that day. She eventually moved away from the life, wrote a book about her time with Bumpy, gave interviews, but she rarely spoke about the funeral incident. To her, it wasn't a moment of pride. It was a moment of necessity. It was simply taking out the trash. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was a legend. He was the godfather of Harlem, the man who'd held the streets together through sheer force of will and strategic genius. But on July 11th, 1968, the world learned something else. Every godfather needs a godmother. Every king needs a queen who's willing to fight for his crown even after he's gone. And if you disrespect her, if you think she's weak because she's grieving, if you mistake dignity for passivity, you won't just lose your reputation, you might just lose your hair. As the sun set on that chaotic, sweltering July day, the streets of Harlem finally quieted. The king was resting, the queen was home, and the order of things, fragile as it was, had been maintained. Mamie sat alone in Bumpy's favorite chair that night, looking at a photograph of him from 1942, young, sharp, invincible. "I handled it, Ellsworth," she whispered to the empty room, "the way you taught me, with strength and style." And somewhere in the great beyond, Bumpy Johnson was probably smiling, because he'd always known the truth that the world learned that day. He might have been the toughest gangster in New York, but he'd married someone even tougher.